Average Joe travels the California Inscape. Season 5, Children of the Pumpkins. Episode 3, Dead Fairies Don't Wear Boots. Story by Penguin Pete. Written by Dodge Zelko. Manor House Restoration by Clyde Wren. And featuring the vocal stylings of This Is Signal. Well, the day had started out humdrum enough, with my chief complaint being Spanky McDongle's inability to brew a pot of coffee. Now I had just set eyes on a corpse, albeit a tiny mythical one, and seen it hurled cavalierly into the Georgian fireplace by a witch woman with a taxidermy fetish. The marble eyes of eccentrically posed mammals, birds, reptiles, arthropods, and so on, kept watch over us, like those commuters of lore on Noah's Ark. This inanimate surveillance was doing nothing for Sammy's nerves. An immortal trapped in a diorama of death, he wore the parquet down with his pacing and developed a bad twitch in his right eye that he persistently swatted at, as if its cause were some pesky mosquito and not his own neural paroxysms. To make matters worse, a leaded skylight permitted us a view of the open blue sky, where a rangy flock of quiver-clad fae-folk were circling Lucretia's domicile like outback vultures over a sweet hunk of rotted wallaby. Lucy reassured us in a not-so-reassuring tone.
The protection sphere will hold over my house for 48 hours. Let's hope they tucker themselves out before then.
These fae folk, I inquired, are they known for their stamina?
What they're known for,
said Anne,
is trickery, deceit, illusion, and disguise. They can assume any form, from an insect to a human child, but not an adult. They have an abiding hatred for the human race. We're about the only exception to their doctrine of peace and harmony. Be very careful around the Fae, Joe. Should you meet up with them, God forbid, never give out any personal information. It will be used against you.
Sounds like my years of dealing with the Chatterskull police have been good practice. Before anyone had a chance to chuckle, the sound of shattering glass sent Anne, Sammy, and I ducking for cover. We were still a little shell-shocked from the rifle shot fired into our office that morning. Lucretia retained her poise before the fireplace.
It's all right. This one's dead, too. That's the only reason it breached the protection sphere.
Another sad little body was splayed out on the floor, a grotesque sight with blue-green flesh and blood-swollen eyes, its discolored tongue lolling out like a wilted flower petal. A reddish-brown dust was caked around its mouth and nose.
An overdose. Nutmeg. Perhaps the greatest scourge of the Fae community. It's very sad in a way. Their jonesing, to use the pedestrian parlance, drives them to be rather unruly.
Sammy's back was flattened to the wall between a regal ocelot and something less recognizable, perhaps a chupacabra. He gave a loud laugh. Unruly, yeah, you said it, lady. They enslaved me. If they could, they'd enslave us all.
Well then, we'd better ensure they don't get to us. Which reminds me, Anne, Joe, aren't you missing a member of your crew? I thought there was a leprechaun in your employ.
Anne and I exchanged bug-eyed looks. Spanky.
They might be searching for him right now to try and squeeze some information out of him. He won't hold up well under enhanced interrogation.
He doesn't hold up well under a strong westerly wind. Lucretia bade us all to stand back and clear a space in the center of the room, where the poor bloated fairy continued to, bloat.
If the Fae have not gotten to him already, I may be able to retrieve your McDingle.
It's McDongle. She muttered a rushed incantation, and her familiar exploded from thin air. No disrespect to Samantha, I indeed was starting to like the cat, but this was much more of a showstopper than Anne's common pet. Enough so that Sammy shrieked and tried to climb the wall. I felt for the guy. Today's sensory overload wasn't letting up. A full-grown Bengal tiger sat there and twitched its tail, awaiting instruction, emitting a baritone purr. It ignored all of us quite haughtily, except for Lucretia.
Run and fetch us the leprechaun, Solomon. Mind that it's the right one. Then bring him back here. If you're a good boy, maybe I'll pick up a quarter cow at the butcher's shop and book you another shampoo session with Roxette.
Solomon, for apparently 'twas his name, seemed in favor of this. For a tiger, he was strangely expressive. With a flourish of his tail, he dove through an open bay window, not upsetting the nasturtiums in the planter box and barely ruffling the cretonne curtains. For future reference, ladies, not every first resort needs to be magical. I could just as easily have phoned Chief Wankins and had him put out an APB for our misplaced colleague.
I'll bear that in mind, Joe. By the way, I never thanked you two for the part you played in getting the flea market shut down. The one out by the airport. My businesses have been booming ever since.
Lucretia's business was a national retail chain of psychics, including tarot, crystal ball, and palm readers, set up in strip malls or outside truck stops from coast to coast. It was called the Psychic Enemies Network, and I can't give them a high enough impartial recommendation. Joe says, bring the whole family round.
Pass my affections on to Wankins, too, the next time you see him.
Of course. Me and the chief have a very affectionate relationship, don't we, Anne? But Anne's attention was on Sammy.
Mr. Spunker, please come out from behind that Bonaboo. I'm sure it was expensive. Why don't you have a seat and try to relax? I assure you, you're quite safe for the time being.
He was on the brink of rejoining us, but with the worst possible timing, Solomon bounded back through the window. And he wasn't alone. Spanky McDongle sat astride his back, waving his little buckled hat like a rodeo cowboy. Solomon deposited him gracefully on the pink, green, and brown Turkish rug. The leprechaun was in such a tizzy that he'd reverted, rather touchingly, to talking in the third person, a habit that several weeks' worth of training with a speech therapist had broken him out of.
Well, isn't this a right can of piss? Spanky's never seen the likes of it. Not since the great Dublin-Doubloon War of 1666. There's a whole army of fae out there, acting a maggot and running rampant over wee Chatterskull. If this big here funny cat hadn't shown when he had the mind to, Spanky'd be wrapped to his gullet in vines, all a-gunning for his dear old lady, and never to tipple another Johnny Jump-Up for the rest of his wee scully days.
Lucretia, Sammy, I believe you remember our associate, Mr. McDongle.
I speak 17 tongues fluently, and understood about a third of that.
Well, you're a right scanger then, ain't ya?
Pardon me? A what? We're glad you're safe, Spanky, but we should probably focus on getting to the bottom of this kerfuffle. Why did the Fae enslave Mr. Spunker here? Why are they running riot in the streets?
Yes, and what was that bit about vines? Spanky dusted his hat off with a few angry slaps, more or less crumpling the thing, then jammed it squarely on his head.
You don't listen. Spanky'll try and put this in plain California English. What he's trying to say is there are pumpkin vines out there strangling people left and right. And not just people. Buildings. Cars. It's a right mess, don't you see? Everything's gone knobs up. The Fae are feuding with each other. There be division in the ranks. A gang war. Plus, down on Francis Mary of the Cross Boulevard, where Spanky got tangled up in his vines, some bounty hunters were having themselves a shootout with the coppers, bullets flying every which way. Meanwhile, some arseways missionary in a purple rain slicker is going on about the end of the world, trying to convert Spanky to join a pagan pumpkin cult, if you can believe that. As if Spanky will ever want to set eyes on another pumpkin between now and the blessed rapture.
With his testimony given, I was more grateful than ever to be sequestered behind a protection sphere in Lucretia's lavish estate. Anne kindly requested that she recall her familiar, as the presence of the Bengal tiger, his model behavior notwithstanding, was discouraging Sammy from stepping out from behind the taxidermied bonobo. Solomon didn't have to be told twice. With what I swore was a genteel nod of his boulder-sized head, the tiger obligingly vanished. Sammy finally made his way back over to us. He looked unsteady on his legs, like a newborn foal, and watched the skylight warily. It had magically repaired itself at some point without my noticing. Lucretia offered him a seat on the divan and something strong to drink.
Better make it 2 there, sweet chicks.
I was tempted to make it 3, but restrained myself in front of the client, lest it undermine his confidence in us. Wait. Was Sammy our client? Were we being paid for any of this? This is perhaps the second most important question a PI can ask. Anne sat beside him.
Why don't you start at the beginning, Sammy? We were rudely interrupted back at the office. Tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to find yourself wrapped up in all of this.
Bollocks?
Spanky offered.
Misfortune.
Anne threw him a dark look. All eyes were now on Sammy Spunker. Lucretia handed him his scotch in an elaborate cut-glass tumbler. He took a deep breath, a sip, another sip, then decided sitting wasn't for him and paced the room as he spoke. It started with my dad, Samuel Spunker Jr. If you can believe it, I'm the third in the line of Sam Spunkers. Sam was my grandfather, then Samuel, then, well, you get it. He was a traveling salesman, hawked everything from snake oil to wire coat hangers to Jesus portraits. World War I rolled around, and the old man was petrified he'd get drafted. God bless him, but he had a short list of laudable traits, and valor sure as hell wasn't one of them. We have more in common than I'd like to admit. One night, so he told, the Fae visited him in a lucid dream. He was at an aquarium in the dream. It was dark and empty, and he was walking down one of those glass passageways with water on all sides. There was very little light beyond the blue of the water. Even though his vision was poor, he sensed he was being watched. And he was. When one of the fish swam up to the glass, he realized it had a woman's face. A beautiful face, to be sure, but not quite a mermaid because it wasn't the full head and torso, see, just the face on the long fish body. You follow me? Pretty face on a fish body. Yo comprendo. Well, the fish introduced herself on behalf of the Fae race. A sort of envoy, see? An ambassador?
Joseph, Mr. McDongle, enough.
I lit a lucky to give my mouth something more productive to do. Sammy went on. She said the Fae would be willing to cut him a deal. You know the story of Rumpelstiltskin. In exchange for his future firstborn, my dad would be granted immortality.
Where the hell was Spanky when these pumpkin-loving pixie powder puffs were passing out perpetuity, eh?
Immortality, Sammy stressed, with some caveats and conditions. He couldn't be killed, but he could still die by accident or by his own hand. My father agreed without hesitation to offer the Fae his firstborn in payment, because he never planned on having kids. In his typical hapless way, though, he got a girl who worked at the roller rink pregnant before he even left for boot camp. A girl named Ursula Rosemarie Blagojevich, my mother. That wasn't the worst of his luck, though, or mine. At St. Mihiel, he blew himself up with a carelessly tossed grenade. It bounced off a tree and landed back in his foxhole with him. That was the end of the second Sam. In accordance with the sneaky fine print of his Fey contract, the curse was passed on to me. Ever since I was a child, if a bully tried to take a swing at me, or if I went sledding with my friends and was heading straight for a telephone pole, I would blink to an alternate dimension until the danger passed. Things got worse when the nutmeg epidemic started laying waste to the Fae. They conscripted me to work in the pumpkin fields. I became a slave, an actual slave, all because of some rashness on my father's part while chatting with a fish in what he thought was a dream. It just goes to show.
Just goes to show what? What exactly does it just go to show?
Well, I'm not sure exactly. Sammy sighed. He downed the remaining liquor in his glass. Anyway, that's it. That's my sad little tale. I escaped the pumpkin fields and wound up on the doorstep of your detective agency. You two have garnered a certain reputation in supernatural circles. Anne rose from the couch, smoothing her plaid pleated skirt, and walked over to rest a solemn hand on Sammy's shoulder.
I'm sorry about the terrible luck you've suffered. I promise we'll do what we can to break you out of this contract. You shouldn't have to pay for your father's mistakes.
Sam Spunker III looked like he might cry. I suddenly had to excuse myself, an unfortunate reflex of mine whenever emotions run too high. I asked Lucretia if she could point me toward the lavatory, though that was just a pretense. I half hoped I could find another decanter of something stiff around here. Alone with my thoughts, meandering the grand corridors, I replayed Sammy's bizarre tale over in my head. It was difficult not to be distracted, however, by the eccentricities lurking in every niche of Lucretia's palatial abode. Opening up a retail chain of soothsayers had certainly been a solvent venture. She employed a pair of Siamese twins, Maya and Zaya, conjoined at the hip in their matching kawaii-made uniforms, to polish and dust various accumulated treasures. The corridor I was wandering at present doubled as a gallery hung with oil portraits of obscure Victorian magicians. An entire room the size of a racquetball court was devoted to her fully stocked apothecary. I didn't set so much as a phalange in there because everything looked quite fragile and precious, not to mention dangerous. A fragrant pall of incense and sage hung around every corner. I discovered yet more taxidermy, the most notable being a two-headed unicorn mounted proudly on a marble dais, beside her 17th century Blanchet harpsichord. All at once, an irritating chirp invaded my revelry. I thought at first that it might be a smoke alarm sounding in the distance, but no, those hadn't been invented yet. I gradually became aware that its source was in spitting distance. I looked around, spinning in circles, excessively agitated. Something about a dull, monotonous, and untraceable ping is more distressing than an out-of-tune brass band. My eyes landed on the nearest windowsill, where perched an innocent, innocuous little cricket who immediately made me feel quite stupid. I suppose my nerves were a bit jangled from the close succession of assassination attempts and fey corpses dropping from the sky. Well, hey there, little fella. Don't you look lost? Where are my manners? I'm Average Joe, and that's all you gotta know. How about I show you the way out of here? As my hand went for the window latch, Lucretia's familiar papaya shellac manicure seized hold of my wrist. I let loose an embarrassing yowl, because I hadn't realized anyone was within earshot.
Wait, no. Etymology is a pet passion of mine, Joe. This is no ordinary cricket. The tegmen is far too sclerotinized. I could hear its stridation from the parlor.
I see. I did not, in fact, see. Well, you had better look into that. She produced another one of those impressive cut-glass tumblers and plopped it upside down over the cricket, encasing it in its own expensive little geodesic dome. Crouching down to meet it at eye level, she muttered a recondite incantation. I reflexively took a cautious step back.
Oi, watch where you're clumping, you clod.
Oh, pardon me. I hadn't realized that Anne and Spanky had accompanied Lucretia. As the hex spilled out of her in a florid whisper, the tumbler began to glow. A neon lemonade light that seared the retinae like the glass had transformed into a 300-watt light bulb. Once the light dimmed, we beheld not a cricket with an overly sclerotinized tegmen. Oh no, but a fairy. A crafty reconnaissance agent who had somehow slipped past the protection sphere and, by dumb luck, had been intercepted by yours truly. I wouldn't say that so much dumb luck as dumb skill. It beat its tiny fists upon the prison, gibbering in its native tongue. Lucretia radiated vexation.
How the devil did it get in here? How can we sweat some answers out of it? There must be ways of making it talk.
Sweat, you say? Another light bulb lit up, this time in my brain. I plucked the lucky strike from my mouth, slid the tumbler toward the edge of the sill so just the tiniest gap was accessible, and thrust my cigarette up into the crevice. Then I flashed a self-satisfied smile at my peers. Anyone got any hickory chips? The fairy coughed, hacked, wheezed, and finally tapped out. I removed the lucky. Lucretia let some smoke vent from the glass before interrogating the detainee in its native tongue. They went back and forth for half a minute or so. Spanky tugged on my coat and mimed for me to bum him a cig. Lucretia stood up straight. She appeared slightly less vexed.
It says it's willing to talk, to give us answers, but it's only a lackey and doesn't know much. It certainly doesn't wield enough clout to change our present circumstances. There's a civil war brewing in the Fey ranks, nutmeg addicts versus Puritans. Unfortunately, Chatterskull Falls appears to be their chosen battlefield.
Spanky shrugged as I held a flame up to my cigarette and said,
It just goes to show.
Just goes to show what? Hey, wait a minute. I scanned the room top to bottom just to make sure I wasn't missing anything. Does anyone know the whereabouts of our old friend Sammy Spunker?